Hey guys, it's Jason J-Boy Usher from KCX Design bringing you yet another installment of the KCX Culture Design Vlog. And today, we're going to talk about color matching in our composites. There are three key areas that need to be given attention for any good Photoshop composite: color, light, and shadow. Every other element can be pure gold, but if you aren't paying attention to these three areas, then your work is going to create a visual conflict, and this prevents your mind from accepting what you see. Today, thanks to my friend Lauren Zen at Zen Photography, I'm going to focus on a few of my favorite color casting techniques for helping to bridge the gap between a background and a foreground image. For today's tutorial, I'm using backgrounds from my personal collection. Now, most of these are a few of my digital speed paintings. However, the foreground image is a stock photograph of a man and his guitar that I picked up from depositphotos.com. Now that we've got all that out of the way, let's get started. Okay, the first method I want to look at is gradient mapping. Now, a gradient map is an adjustment layer that uses tone to apply a gradient, instead of creating a linear or a radial gradation like you would when you use the gradient tool. This is one of the first methods for creating color balance that I learned when I started compositing. Basically, I would use a gradient map when all of my other elements were in place to create visual unity. For simple composites, this method works very well. First, I go to the Adjustment Layers menu at the bottom of your Layers panel, and you choose Gradient Mapping. This immediately overlays a gradient mask, which you can change in the Properties panel as long as the layer is active. In the Gradient drop-down, you'll find a Settings icon, and from there, I like to choose the Photographic Toning option. From here, you can jump right into choosing a gradient tone that you like. Then you set your blending mode to Overlay, and then I bring my opacity all the way down and then reintroduce it to the image slowly until I like the final result. The results of this method will vary from image to image, and in my experience, the more simple a composite, the better the result. But this is an excellent place to start. Another simple technique I started using in the beginning was the solid color adjustment layer. This is usually referred to as a fill layer. Again, this technique will vary in mileage, but it tends to work great in simple composites. You can apply this technique to all layers, but I've found that clipping mask yields more control and a much better overall result. Okay, so the first thing I do is I hit the eyedropper tool. I use my keyboard shortcut, which is the letter I, and I choose a foreground color somewhere near the leg of the man. Where you choose to color sample, that's entirely up to you. This way, when I go into my adjustment layer and I choose solid color, the color I want is already loaded up. That means all I have to do is right-click the layer and make it a clipping mask. Now, once it's a clipping mask, I set the blending mode to Overlay, and then I reduce the opacity until I like the result. This is fast and it's simple, but it's not overly satisfying on most images. This is yet another method that works very well on simple backgrounds. In more complex composites, gradient maps and color fills, they just aren't going to cut it. So what I started doing was experimenting with curves adjustment layers in order to affect my foreground objects. So first, I create a curves adjustment layer. Now you can use curves layers on the entire image and get decent results, but understand that you will affect anything under this layer. So I tend to apply a clipping mask to keep my background unaffected. In this image, the prime color is a light blue, and there are a few ways you can go about this. First, I grab the prime color area using the finger icon, which allows you to selectively choose an area of interest on your image and adjust the overall color based on the pixels of that particular point. I just slide up on the middle area of the background to bring the image brightness to a place that works for the image. However, the real magic is when you explore adjusting the curves on either the red, blue, or green color channels using the color channels dropdown. This dropdown is set to RGB by default, but you can choose these channels individually. There's a lot of blue on this image, so that's where I start after my initial adjustment. Then I play with the greens just a little, and then finally, I bring my reds down just a bit. Of everything I'm going to show you, these curves adjustment will give you the most control. You can also use levels to accentuate the technique, or you can use it in place of it. However, sometimes speed is an issue, and that's going to bring us to our next method. This next method involves using a Gaussian blur layer. Now, I picked this technique up from Corey Barker a few years ago, and it's one of my favorite fast techniques. Okay, so the first thing I do is I take the background image, and then I'm going to duplicate it, and then I move the layer to the top of the image I want to color match and create a clipping mask. And voila, perfectly color matched. Just kidding. Well, sorta. Because before I start working on the layer, I convert it into a smart layer. So if I need to adjust my blur without starting over, well, then I can do that. Then I go to my filter gallery, get into the blur menu, and I choose a Gaussian blur. I typically just turn my background into a muddy mass of color by increasing the blur effect. I don't want anything distinguishable in the image. Once I'm happy, then I can put the effect into play and start working on the blend and the opacity. I start with a soft light, and then I reduce the opacity down to around 50%. More often than not, this is the magic number. If I'm not happy, well, then I can jump over to overlay, and if that doesn't work, I start playing with the opacity. But soft light at 50% almost always gets it done. And that brings us to color balance. In the adjustments levels menu, there is a tool called the color balance tool, and I've always used it to play with white balance. But generally, what it does is play with the overall color mixture of your entire image. You can use it as a clipping mask on select objects, or you can just play with the overall tonality of your image. So I create the color balance layer, and then I use the properties panel when I have that layer selected to make adjustments to each color channel on tones for either the shadow, the highlight, or the midtones. For best results, you're going to want to play with all three. I find that subtle adjustments yield the best results, but what it all comes down to really is the nature of the composite, the type of contrast that you're going for, and what you're expecting with your end results. This method is quick, it's easy, and you get almost as much control as you get when you use curves layers. And finally, that brings us to the match color tool. Now, I just recently discovered this tool, but it's really cool. Basically, you can color match two layers in an image using an automated tool. It does a lot of the heavy thinking for you. Okay, so first, you're going to choose the layer that you want to adjust. And then you're going to go to the image menu. You're going to choose adjustments, and then you're going to find match color towards the bottom of the screen. This opens up a new work panel. You can match with either images opened in other files, or you can work on an image within the same composite. Here, we want to match to a background image. So we just choose source and make sure the current PSD is selected. Just under this drop down is a list of all the layers in our file. So we choose the one we want. In this case, it's J. Usher Forest Fire. Now, Photoshop does its best to match the colors automatically. It's all right, but hardly ever good enough. So the next thing I do is I jump into my luminance and I adjust the brightness of the image a bit. Then I go in and I decide how intense I want the color to be. 100% is pretty balanced, but you can bump that up depending on the overall look you're going for. I usually bring the intensity way up, and then I use the fade adjustments to control how much of the effect is carried over. From there, you just play with the adjustments until you're happy with the end results. And that concludes my toolbox for harmonizing the color in my composite elements. Obviously, color is only one aspect of a good composite, and these images would require some work with shadows and light to really make them work together. But hopefully, this helps you to start thinking about color unity, and it gives you some ideas on where it is that you can start. So once again, this is Jason J-Boy Usher from the KCX Culture Design Vlog, reminding you to go out, to create, to design, and to inspire.